14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was sleeping peacefully in her bedroom when a man with a knife slipped through an open window and whispered terrifying words that would haunt her family for months. But 9 months later, as police officers patrolled a quiet street in Sandy, Utah, they spot a girl walking between two adults, and something about her face makes them look twice, leading to a discovery that would shock the nation and reveal how one teenager's incredible courage and intelligence kept her alive through an ordeal that defied belief. Salt Lake City, Utah, in the early 2000s, was the kind of place where families felt safe leaving their windows cracked open on warm summer nights. The community was tight-knit, built around strong family values and mutual trust that came from generations of neighbors looking out for one another. The Smart family embodied everything that made this community special. Edward and Lois Smart had built a loving home for their 6 children, creating an environment where faith, education, and family bonds were the foundation of daily life. Their Federal Heights neighborhood was filled with large, well-maintained homes where children rode bicycles freely, and parents rarely worried about their safety. Elizabeth Ann Smart was the second of the 6 Smart children, and at 14 years old, she possessed the kind of bright, confident personality that made her a natural leader among her siblings and peers. She was an accomplished harpist who performed regularly at church and community events, a dedicated student who took her education seriously, and a responsible older sister who helped care for her younger siblings. The Smart family was deeply religious, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and their faith played a central role in how they approached every aspect of their lives. This religious foundation provided Elizabeth with a strong moral compass and an inner strength that would prove crucial during the darkest period of her life. Elizabeth shared a bedroom with her 9-year-old sister Mary Catherine in the family's comfortable home on Christiana Circle. The two girls had a close relationship, typical of sisters who were near enough in age to be companions, but far enough apart for Elizabeth to feel protective of her younger sibling. Their bedroom was on the 2nd floor of the house, with windows that faced the quiet residential street below. On the evening of June 4, 2002, the Smart family had followed their usual routine. The children had completed their homework and chores, the family had shared dinner together, and evening prayers had been said before everyone headed to bed. It was the kind of ordinary family evening that millions of American families experience every night, with no hint of the terror that was about to unfold. Edward Smart had spent part of that evening working in the yard, enjoying the warm weather, and taking pride in maintaining the beautiful landscaping around their home. Like many homeowners, he occasionally hired help for larger projects, and several months earlier, he had employed a man who called himself Emmanuel to help with some roof work on their house. This worker, whose real name was Brian David Mitchell, had seemed harmless enough during his brief time working for the family. He was eccentric and spoke frequently about religious topics, but in a community where strong religious faith was common, his behavior did not raise serious alarm bells. The Smart family had paid him for his work and thought little about him afterward. What the Smart family could not have known was that Mitchell had spent those hours working on their roof, carefully observing their home, their routines, and their family dynamics. He had noted which rooms belonged to which family members, when people came and went, and most importantly, he had identified Elizabeth as his target. Mitchell was not simply an odd handyman with religious obsessions. He was a dangerous predator who had developed an elaborate delusional system that he used to justify horrific crimes. He claimed to receive revelations from God that commanded him to take multiple wives, and he had convinced his wife Wanda Barzee to participate in his twisted plans. Barzee herself was a troubled woman who had become completely dependent on Mitchell's manipulative control. She had abandoned her own children from a previous marriage to follow Mitchell's increasingly extreme religious delusions, and she had been transformed from a functioning adult into an accomplice in his criminal schemes. Together, Mitchell and Barzee had spent months planning Elizabeth's kidnapping. They had scouted the Smart home repeatedly, learning the family's patterns and identifying the best way to gain entry without being detected. Mitchell had convinced Barzee that taking Elizabeth was part of God's plan for their lives, a religious mission that justified any action they might need to take. The couple had been living as transients, moving between homeless camps in the mountains surrounding Salt Lake City and occasionally staying in abandoned buildings or makeshift shelters. Mitchell had prepared a campsite in the foothills where he planned to take Elizabeth, complete with supplies and restraints that revealed the premeditated nature of his intentions. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was completely unaware that she had become the target of such an elaborate and dangerous plan. She was focused on typical teenage concerns, her harp lessons, school activities, and spending time with friends and family. Her biggest worry was probably an upcoming recital or homework assignment, not the possibility that a predator was planning to destroy her life. The Smart family's sense of security was built on reasonable assumptions about their community and their precautions. They lived in a safe neighborhood, they were careful about locking doors and windows, and they had taught their children about basic safety measures. But they could not have anticipated the level of planning and determination that Mitchell had brought to his criminal scheme. As Elizabeth and Mary Catherine settled into their beds on the night of June 4th, everything seemed normal and safe. The windows were opened slightly to let in the cool evening air. The house was quiet except for the normal sounds of a family settling down for the night, and both girls expected to wake up the next morning to another ordinary day. Elizabeth had no way of knowing that Mitchell was already moving toward their house, carrying a knife and rope, prepared to change her life forever. She could not have imagined that her faith, intelligence, and inner strength were about to be tested in ways that would challenge everything she thought she knew about survival and hope. The stage was set for a confrontation between innocence and evil, between a protected childhood and unthinkable violence. But Elizabeth Smart was stronger than anyone, including her kidnapper, could have possibly imagined, and her journey through the next 9 months would demonstrate the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of absolute terror. In the early morning hours of June 5, 2002, Brian David Mitchell approached the Smart family home with the methodical precision of someone who had planned every detail of his crime. He had been watching the house for hours, waiting for the neighborhood to settle into deep sleep before making his move. Mitchell cut through the screen of a kitchen window that he knew would provide access to the home's interior. He moved through the house with surprising quiet for such a large man, navigating the familiar layout that he had memorized during his time working as a handyman for the family months earlier. Elizabeth was awakened by a voice whispering her name and the terrifying sensation of cold metal against her throat. In the darkness of her bedroom, she could make out the silhouette of a man holding a knife, but her mind struggled to process what was happening. This kind of violence was so far outside her experience that it seemed more like a nightmare than reality. Mitchell spoke in low, threatening tones, telling Elizabeth that he had a knife at her throat and that he would kill her and her family if she made any noise or tried to resist. The combination of the blade against her skin and his quiet but menacing words paralyzed Elizabeth with terror, exactly as Mitchell had intended. Mary Catherine, sleeping in the bed next to her sister, was awakened by the whispered conversation, but had the presence of mind to remain completely still and silent. Through half-closed eyes, she watched as the man forced Elizabeth to put on shoes and a robe before leading her out of the bedroom and away from everything she had ever known as safe and secure. The few minutes that Elizabeth spent being led through her own home at knife point felt like hours to her. Every step took her further from her family, and closer to an unknown fate that she could not even begin to comprehend. Mitchell's threats about killing her family if she resisted echoed in her mind, making her feel responsible for protecting everyone she loved by cooperating with her captor. Mary Catherine lay frozen in her bed for what felt like an eternity after Elizabeth and the man disappeared from their room. She was torn between the desperate desire to run for help and the paralyzing fear that any movement might bring the dangerous stranger back to hurt her or other members of their family. Finally, several hours after Elizabeth had been taken, Mary Catherine crept to her parents' bedroom and woke them with words that would haunt the Smart family forever. "Elizabeth is gone, and I think someone took her." The devastating simplicity of that statement marked the beginning of a nightmare that would consume their lives for the next 9 months. Edward and Lois Smart's initial reaction was disbelief mixed with panic. They searched every room of the house, every closet and hiding place where Elizabeth might have gone on her own, desperately hoping that Mary Catherine had been mistaken about what she had witnessed. But Elizabeth's shoes were missing from her room, along with the robe she had been wearing, and there was no trace of her anywhere in the house. The realization that their daughter had been kidnapped hit the Smart family like a physical blow. Edward immediately called the police, while Lois began the agonizing process of waking their other children to make sure they were safe and to begin the desperate search for any clues about what had happened to Elizabeth. Salt Lake City police responded quickly to the call, but the scene they encountered offered few immediate leads. There were no signs of a struggle in Elizabeth's bedroom, no obvious evidence left behind by the kidnapper, and no witnesses other than 9-year-old Mary Catherine, who had seen the incident in darkness and could provide only limited details about the man who had taken her sister. The police investigation began immediately, but the first crucial hours were marked by confusion and limited information. Mary Catherine's account of what she had witnessed was consistent but vague. She described a man with a cap or hat who had spoken quietly to Elizabeth before leading her away, but she could not provide details about his appearance that would help identify him. Within hours, the smart home was transformed into a command center for one of the most intensive missing child investigations in Utah history. FBI agents joined local police officers, search and rescue teams prepared to comb through the surrounding mountains and wilderness areas, and volunteers began organizing efforts to distribute Elizabeth's photograph throughout the region. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Elizabeth's disappearance quickly became a national news story, with her photograph appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages across the country. The combination of her young age, the shocking nature of her disappearance from her own bedroom, and her family's prominence in the community created a story that captured public attention and sympathy. Edward and Lois Smart made the difficult decision to speak publicly about their daughter's kidnapping, appearing at press conferences to plead for her safe return and to keep her story in the public eye. Their composure and faith during these appearances was remarkable, but those who knew them could see the devastating toll that Elizabeth's disappearance was taking on the entire family. The search for Elizabeth expanded rapidly to include vast areas of wilderness surrounding Salt Lake City. Hundreds of volunteers joined professional search teams in combing through canyons, forests, and mountain trails where a kidnapper might have taken a victim. Search dogs were brought in to follow any possible scent trails, and helicopters surveyed areas that were inaccessible on foot. Despite the massive effort, no trace of Elizabeth was found in those initial searches. The lack of physical evidence or witnesses who had seen anything suspicious on the night of her disappearance left investigators with few concrete leads to pursue. They interviewed known sex offenders in the area, followed up on tips from the public, and investigated anyone who had recent contact with the Smart family, but none of these efforts yielded breakthrough information. As days turned into weeks, the emotional strain on the Smart family became increasingly visible. Mary Catherine was struggling with trauma from witnessing her sister's kidnapping. The younger children were confused and frightened by the constant presence of police and media attention, and Edward and Lois were caught between hope and despair as each day passed without news of Elizabeth. The case took on a life of its own in the media, with daily coverage of the search efforts and regular updates on the investigation's progress. Elizabeth's face became familiar to millions of Americans who followed the story and hoped for her safe return. But the massive public attention also brought its own challenges for the family and investigators. Meanwhile, unknown to everyone searching for her, Elizabeth was being held just miles away in the mountains above Salt Lake City. Mitchell had taken her to a makeshift camp that he and Barzy had prepared, where she was chained to trees, forced to participate in a mock marriage ceremony, and subjected to daily sexual assault and psychological torture. The location where Mitchell held Elizabeth was remote but not impossibly distant from civilization. Search teams came close to the camp on several occasions, but Mitchell had chosen the site carefully to avoid detection, and he moved Elizabeth frequently to different locations to reduce the chances of being discovered. Elizabeth's survival during those first weeks and months of captivity required incredible mental and emotional strength. She was completely cut off from her family and the outside world, subjected to constant threats and violence, and forced to endure conditions that would have broken many adults. But she maintained hope that she would somehow survive and return home, even when Mitchell told her that her family had stopped looking for her. As the months passed, the massive search effort gradually scaled back, though it never completely stopped. The Smart family continued to advocate for Elizabeth and to keep her story in the public eye. But the reality was that without new leads or evidence, the investigation had reached a plateau that was frustrating for everyone involved. The 9th month of Elizabeth's captivity arrived with no indication that her ordeal was approaching an end. Mitchell had become increasingly bold, moving Elizabeth closer to populated areas, and even taking her into public places while disguising her appearance with wigs and veils. His confidence that he would never be caught had grown over the months, leading him to take risks that would ultimately prove to be his downfall. March 12, 2003 started as an ordinary day for Salt Lake City police officers Nancy Merkovich and Karen Jones as they patrolled the quiet streets of Sandy, Utah. The suburb was experiencing typical midday activity. People running errands, children playing in yards, residents going about their normal routines without any hint that one of the most wanted fugitives in America was walking among them. Officer Merkovich was driving slowly through a residential area when something caught her attention that made her look twice. Walking along the sidewalk were 3 people who seemed somehow out of place in the suburban setting: a man with long hair and robes, a woman in similar religious garb, and between them, a younger person whose face was partially obscured by a grey wig and veil. There was something about the trio that struck Miraculous as unusual, though she could not immediately identify what had triggered her instincts. The way they moved, their clothing, and especially something about the younger person's posture and demeanor sent up red flags that made her decide to investigate further. Miraculous radioed for backup and approached the three individuals, identifying herself as a police officer and asking to speak with them. The man immediately identified himself as Emmanuel and began speaking in the rambling religious language that had become his trademark. He claimed to be a minister doing God's work and traveling with his family. But as Miraculous looked more closely at the younger person standing between the two adults, she felt a shock of recognition that made her heart race. Despite the disguise of the wig and veil, despite the 9 months that had passed since the kidnapping, and despite the way the girl's appearance had been altered, something about her face was unmistakably familiar. Officer Jones arrived as backup, and together the two officers began asking more detailed questions about the trio's identities and their reasons for being in the area. The man calling himself Emmanuel became increasingly agitated as the questioning continued, insisting that they were simply religious pilgrims who should be allowed to continue on their way. The woman, later identified as Wanda Bazi, remained largely silent during the interaction, keeping her eyes downcast and appearing to defer completely to Mitchell's authority. Her behavior suggested someone who had been thoroughly dominated and controlled, unable or unwilling to act independently, even when faced with police officers. But it was the young person's behavior that convinced the officers they had stumbled onto something significant. Despite attempts to remain hidden behind the veil and wig, there were moments when her posture, her movements, and brief glimpses of her face triggered the officers' memories of a missing person case that had dominated headlines for months. Officer Miraculous made the decision to separate the young person from the two adults, asking her to step aside for a private conversation. This request caused Mitchell to become even more agitated, insisting that the girl was his daughter and that separating them was unnecessary and inappropriate. When Miraculous was able to speak with the girl privately, she asked a simple but crucial question: "Are you Elizabeth Smart?" The response came as a whisper so quiet that the officer had to ask her to repeat it, but the word yes changed everything in an instant. The confirmation that this was indeed Elizabeth Smart sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and marked the beginning of a carefully orchestrated operation to ensure her safety and the arrest of her captors. Additional officers were called to the scene, and arrangements were made to transport Elizabeth to safety while taking Mitchell and Bazi into custody. Mitchell's reaction to being arrested was characteristic of his delusional mindset. He continued to insist that he was a religious prophet doing God's work, and that the police were interfering with a divine mission. He showed no remorse for what he had done to Elizabeth, and seemed genuinely surprised that his actions were being treated as criminal rather than religious. Bazi's response was more subdued but equally disturbing. She appeared to be living in a completely different reality from the one around her, seemingly unable to comprehend that she had participated in the kidnapping and abuse of a child. Her psychological dependence on Mitchell was so complete that she seemed incapable of independent thought or action. The news that Elizabeth Smart had been found alive spread like wildfire through Salt Lake City and then across the nation. The Smart family, who had maintained hope but had also begun to prepare themselves for the worst possible outcome, received the call that every parent of a missing child dreams of but few ever experience. Edward Smart later described the moment he learned Elizabeth had been found as a mixture of overwhelming joy, disbelief, and profound gratitude. After 9 months of living with the constant fear that they might never see their daughter again, the reality that she was alive and safe seemed almost too good to be true. The reunion between Elizabeth and her family took place at a Salt Lake City hospital, where she was taken for medical evaluation and to begin the process of transitioning back to the world she had been forced to leave behind. The first moments of that reunion were private, allowing the family to process their emotions and begin to reconnect after 9 months of separation and trauma. Medical professionals who examined Elizabeth were amazed by her physical condition, considering the ordeal she had endured. While she had lost weight and showed signs of the psychological trauma she had experienced, she had not suffered the severe physical injuries that many had feared. Her survival was a testament to her strength and resilience, but also to her intelligence in finding ways to endure Mitchell's abuse without suffering permanent physical harm. The law enforcement officers who had been involved in the search for Elizabeth experienced their own emotional reactions to her discovery. Many had worked tirelessly for months, following hundreds of leads and conducting countless interviews, always hoping but never knowing if their efforts would ultimately be successful. Finding Elizabeth alive was the kind of outcome that reminds officers why they chose careers in law enforcement. The media response to Elizabeth's recovery was as intense as the coverage of her disappearance had been. News crews descended on Salt Lake City from around the world, eager to report on the miraculous discovery and to learn details about how she had survived her ordeal. The Smart family made the decision to protect Elizabeth's privacy during her initial recovery period, limiting media access while she began to heal from her trauma. Mitchell and Barzy were charged with kidnapping and a host of other serious crimes related to Elizabeth's captivity. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including Elizabeth's identification of them as her captors and physical evidence that linked them to the crime. The legal process that followed would take years to complete, but the most important outcome had already been achieved. Elizabeth was safe and free. The discovery of Elizabeth Smart walking down a street in Sandy, Utah, became one of the most celebrated rescues in American law enforcement history. The combination of alert police officers, Elizabeth's own courage in identifying herself, and the persistence of everyone who had never given up searching for her, created a moment of triumph that offered hope to families of missing children everywhere. The fact that Elizabeth had been found not through a dramatic rescue operation or a breakthrough in forensic evidence, but through the simple alertness of patrol officers doing their daily jobs, highlighted the importance of keeping missing person cases in the public eye and training law enforcement to recognize potential victims even months or years after they disappear. Elizabeth Smart's return to her family marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, but the journey from victim to survivor would require years of healing, growth, and remarkable personal strength. The 14-year-old girl who had been taken from her bedroom had experienced trauma that would have destroyed many people, yet she approached her recovery with the same intelligence and determination that had kept her alive during 9 months of captivity. The process of readjusting to normal life after such an ordeal presented challenges that few people can imagine. Elizabeth had to relearn how to feel safe in her own home, how to sleep without fear, and how to trust that the people around her would protect rather than harm her. Simple activities that she had taken for granted before her kidnapping, walking to school, sleeping with the window open, being alone in a room, now required conscious effort and courage. One of the most remarkable aspects of Elizabeth's recovery was her decision to speak publicly about her experience, first in carefully controlled interviews and later in more detailed accounts that would help other survivors and educate the public about the realities of kidnapping and abuse. This choice required incredible bravery, as it meant reliving painful memories and exposing herself to public scrutiny at a time when she was still healing. Elizabeth's family played a crucial role in her recovery, providing the unconditional love and support that allowed her to begin healing from her trauma. The Smart family's faith was central to how they processed the experience, and Elizabeth has spoken about how her religious beliefs helped sustain her during the darkest moments of her captivity and her recovery. The legal proceedings against Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzy extended for several years, creating an additional source of stress for Elizabeth and her family. Mitchell's mental competency became a central issue in his case, as defense attorneys argued that his religious delusions made him unfit to stand trial. This legal strategy meant that Elizabeth had to testify multiple times about her ordeal, reliving the trauma in courtrooms filled with strangers. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth approached her testimony with composure and strength that impressed everyone who witnessed it. She provided clear, detailed accounts of her kidnapping and abuse, helping ensure that Mitchell and Barzy would face appropriate consequences for their crimes. Her willingness to participate in the legal process, despite the personal cost, demonstrated her commitment to justice and her desire to prevent other children from experiencing similar trauma. Mitchell was ultimately found competent to stand trial, and was convicted on federal charges of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. Barzy pleaded guilty to similar charges and received a 15-year sentence, though she was released in 2018 after serving her full term. Elizabeth's decision to become an advocate for missing children and survivors of abuse has been one of the most powerful aspects of her journey from victim to survivor. She has worked with law enforcement agencies to improve procedures for handling kidnapping cases, testified before Congress about legislation to protect children, and spoken at countless events to raise awareness about child safety and the warning signs of predatory behavior. In 2013, Elizabeth published a memoir titled My Story, which provided her own detailed account of her kidnapping, captivity, and recovery. The book became a bestseller and offered readers an unprecedented look into the mind of a survivor, showing how someone can endure unthinkable trauma and emerge stronger and more determined to help others. Elizabeth has also become a powerful voice in discussions about victim shaming and the importance of supporting survivors rather than judging them. She has spoken eloquently about how society's tendency to blame victims or question their choices during traumatic events can cause additional harm and discourage others from seeking help or reporting crimes. Her work as an advocate has taken her around the world, speaking to audiences about child safety, the reality of human trafficking, and the importance of never giving up hope when a child goes missing. Her message consistently emphasizes that survival is possible, that healing can occur, and that trauma does not have to define a person's entire life. Elizabeth married Matthew Gilmore in 2012, and the couple has built a happy family together with their 3 children. Her ability to form healthy, trusting relationships after experiencing such severe trauma is a testament to her resilience and the effectiveness of the support system that surrounded her during her recovery. The Elizabeth Smart case also led to significant improvements in how law enforcement agencies handle missing child cases. The massive search effort and media attention that surrounded her disappearance created new models for Amber Alerts, community involvement in searches, and the importance of maintaining public awareness even when cases become weeks or months old. The case highlighted the crucial role that observant police officers can play in recovering missing children. Officers Merkovich and Jones have been recognized as heroes for their alertness and quick thinking, and their actions are now used as training examples for patrol officers around the country. Elizabeth's story has been adapted into several television documentaries and movies, each helping to keep public attention focused on the issues of child safety and the reality that recovery is possible even in the most dire circumstances. She has been involved in many of these productions, ensuring that they accurately represent her experience and convey meaningful messages about survival and hope. Perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth Smart has demonstrated that it is possible to move beyond trauma and build a meaningful, productive life focused on helping others. Rather than allowing her kidnapping to define her, she has used her experience as a platform for advocacy and education that has undoubtedly prevented other children from experiencing similar trauma. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, human resilience can triumph over evil. Elizabeth's survival was not just a physical miracle, it was proof of the strength that exists within all of us, waiting to be called upon when we face seemingly impossible challenges. Today, Elizabeth continues her advocacy work while raising her family and building a life that honors both her survival and her commitment to protecting other children. Her journey from victim to survivor to advocate represents one of the most inspiring examples of human resilience and the power of hope to overcome even the most devastating circumstances. If you found Elizabeth's incredible journey as inspiring as we did, make sure to subscribe to Criminal Mind Cortex for more extraordinary true crime cases that showcase the amazing strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into cases that prove the power of hope, courage, and determination can overcome even the darkest evil.